Hey everyone, welcome. I am absolutely thrilled you are joining us today because, honestly, we're exploring something truly special. In this explainer, we're going to be unpacking a really beautiful Bengali fairy tale. It's called The Kingdom of Glass, or Kancher Rajato. Now, I know we usually think of fairy tales as, just simple bedtime stories for kids, but as we're going to see today, they're actually incredibly sophisticated tools for teaching empathy. This specific story uses a very abstract, literal setting, this cold, rigid world of glass, to teach a deeply warm and enduring moral lesson about kindness. It's such a fascinating narrative structure, and I literally cannot wait to break it all down with you.
Okay, let's dive into this. Right off the bat, the source text hits us with this profoundly dramatic translation that completely sets the stakes for the entire story. It says, "The world is hard, but you are the only way." Take a second and really think about what that means. The narrative isn't just feeding us a standard story about a prince or some magical faraway kingdom. It's directly addressing the actual emotional stakes of navigating a really difficult, unforgiving world. It openly acknowledges the harshness of reality, but then it immediately positions the individual, and specifically their capacity for humanity, as the ultimate solution.
So to deconstruct all of this, here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll step into the Glass Kingdom. Then, we'll examine the illusion of power, followed by the duty to humanity. Next, we'll see how to find peace and kindness, before wrapping it all up with our core takeaway, that the ultimate magic is love.
All right, part one. Welcome to the Glass Kingdom. Setting the scene.
Every good fairy tale uses its setting to reflect its internal conflicts, and this one immediately establishes a super harsh environment. We are introduced to a world filled with what's phonetically described as Jantrona. That translates roughly to suffering or agony. So this isn't your lively, vibrant, colorful kingdom, right? It's defined by cold, rigid machinery. The prince who rules this distant domain is surrounded by a system that prioritizes pure mechanics and unyielding structure, way above any kind of feeling. And this perfectly frames the initial problem of the story. Because when a society operates like a cold, heartless machine and its leaders are completely disconnected from the real world, the people within it experience Jantrona. The setting itself is basically a physical manifestation of a world completely lacking in kindness.
Moving right along to section 2, the illusion of power and the core conflict.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why fairy tales teach kindness, because we have to look at what kindness is actually fighting against. What is the enemy here? In this tale, the antagonist isn't, a fire-breathing dragon or some evil sorcerer. It's an ideology. On one hand, we have Shakti, which represents raw power, force, and that cold machinery of the kingdom we just explored. But on the other hand, we have Manusha, which stands for humanity, empathy, and actual mortal connection. The fairy tale sets these two concepts directly at odds with each other. The cold pursuit of power creates this total, crushing isolation, while the necessary warmth of humanity is what's actually required to truly live. So the prince's reliance on Shakti is really nothing more than an illusion of control. It's just masking this deep, hollow void where Manusha should actually be.
Which brings us to section 3, the duty to humanity, finding purpose. So how exactly do the characters bridge that terrible void between raw power and true humanity? Well, they begin to realize that their true obligations extend way beyond just accumulating magic or ruling a glass kingdom or wielding authority over other people. The whole narrative hinges entirely on this one very specific phrase from the source material, Manusha Prati Dharma, and this translates so beautifully to the inherent duty of humans toward other humans. This right here is where the story explicitly reveals why fairy tales are such incredible vehicles for teaching kindness. It's telling us that our dharma, our fundamental cosmic or moral duty, isn't about maintaining the complex machinery of this glass kingdom. It's entirely about how we treat one another. Empathy isn't just some nice-to-have character trait. It is an active, vital duty that we absolutely owe to the world.
Let's move to and see how this builds across their emotional journey. Watch how the narrative actually maps this out for us. We start in phase 1 with that initial isolation and suffering, the Jantrona, right? But then a really vital shift happens in phase 2. The characters start seeking the truth and actually speaking openly to one another, Kule Bolo. And this newfound vulnerability leads directly into phase 3, which is the act of Nimantran, or inviting the mother and father. This step is huge. It symbolizes a massive return to foundational human connections and generational family ties. And finally, the whole journey culminates in phase 4, finding Sukhe Shanti, which means true peace. It's honestly a perfect narrative map of how breaking down our emotional walls naturally leads to connection and harmony.
Let's look at section 4, finding peace and kindness, the resolution.
Now, the coldness of the Glass Kingdom doesn't just, quietly fade away on its own. It is actively and permanently shattered by intentional choices. The text outlines very specific, actionable steps that the characters take to resolve their conflict. First up, they reveal the whole truth. They deliberately stop hiding behind the literal glass walls of their kingdom. Second, they actively work to create a state of humanity, fully leaning into that Manushya Prati Dharma that we just talked about. Third, they invite the mother and father, explicitly honoring family over solitary cold rule. And fourth, through these very human, intentional actions, they finally establish peace. It's a literal masterclass in showing the audience that kindness is a series of deliberate, proactive actions. It's for sure not just a passive feeling that you sit around waiting for.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the direct result of those human actions. The phrase Sukhe Shanti means granting peace and happiness. The kingdom's entire atmosphere undergoes this massive, complete, and positive shift. And what that proves is that the Jantrana, that heavy suffering we saw at the very beginning of the story, was never a permanent condition of the world at all. It was simply a symptom of a lack of humanity. Once empathy and truth are actively injected back into the environment by the characters, peace and happiness are finally granted.
And that brings us to our final section, Section 5. The ultimate magic is love, our core takeaway. So the crucial point is really distilling exactly why this fairy tale acts as such a powerful delivery system for these vital moral lessons. It all comes down to this concept of balabhasha. In Bengali, this means profound love and kindness. The story shows us, without a doubt, that balabhasha is what ultimately triumphs over mere machinery and glass walls and raw power. The true magic in this fairy tale isn't a spell, it isn't some crazy enchantment, and it isn't a glowing magical artifact. The magic is love. It's the active, daily practice of kindness that actually breaks the rigid glass of isolation. Fairy tales teach us this because they purposefully strip away all the overwhelming, messy complexities of our real lives, just to show us the raw, undeniable power of basic human goodness.
Which brings us to a final thought I want to leave you with today. The source text reminds us very early on that the earth is hard, right? That it can often feel just as cold and fragile as the kingdom of glass itself. So I have to ask, if the world is hard like glass, is kindness your only unbreakable magic? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep reflecting on the stories you consume, and please remember that sometimes the simplest tales carry the absolute most profound truths. See you next time.